Do you know what's common across these renders by Max Hay, Ian Hubert, and Polyfjord? They've mastered the 3 fundamental building blocks that will turn your renders into something godly. So let's get into them. So the 3 things you need to master is modeling, texturing, and lighting. Nothing crazy, right? But if you haven't mastered all 3, your scenes won't look good. You can't have a good scene with bad lighting or bad texturing or bad modeling. So let me go through the tips, tricks, and knowledge I've gathered from all these pros across YouTube so you can master these 3 things quicker than anybody else. Let's start off with lighting. First off, you need to stop using HDRIs. To become an expert at lighting, you need to be able to light stuff without using HDRIs at all. Here's a quick breakdown of what the lights in Blender are best used for. Area lights are a great primary light to light most of your scene. Point lights are great for rim light, and spotlights are great for adding highlights. If you bring that spot size down and the wattage up, you can try using the 3-point lighting setup that's a native add-on in Blender and just play around with these lights with a basic scene. Also want to make sure you get your full dynamic range out of your lighting setup in Blender. Now, what's dynamic range? Dynamic range is basically the amount of light the camera can capture before it loses detail in the whites and the blacks. So that's basically where it clips. So in Blender, this basically just means turning up your lights a little bit more to just make sure that everything's well illuminated and even a little bit too bright. You can always check the amount of light in your scene by changing your color management to false color, and that will just give you an idea of how blown out your scene is. Another way to make your lighting more dynamic in Blender is by using reflectors and flags. These are things they actually use on movie sets, and a reflector is what its name is, basically just a piece of white reflective material that bounces sunlight or whatever back onto your subject, and a flag is the opposite. It's like a black piece of material that blocks the light to add some like directionality. So you can just do that in Blender by adding a white plane and a black plane, and that can just add some more dynamics to your lighting and refocus it on your subject. Lastly, color can be a great way to augment the lighting in your scenes. I mean, I think everyone's seen like the teal on one side and the orange on the other. That's always a great way to do it. There's always pink and blue, all that kind of stuff. Keep it simple with your lighting, and I'm sure in no time you'll be an expert at it. So that's lighting. Let's move on to texturing. Depending on what you're actually texturing changes a lot of the techniques. So if you want to do up close shots of objects, you want high detail, which means mixing principal BSDFs together and plugging in pictures of grunge and scratches into that factor of the mix shader. You can also use the ambient occlusion node to add some dirt in the cracks of your model. To get really good at this kind of texturing, you want to study real life reference. So a great way to practice this kind of high detail texturing is to model some basic objects from around your house and texture them to make them look as realistic as possible in Blender. When you texture for environments, you don't have to put as much thought and time into your textures. I mean, if you look at William Langren, for example, right, who's a legend at making environments, he just uses like pictures of concrete from textures.com and plugs it into the roughness and the bump map with color ramps. Or he uses some random PBR texture from Quixel Bridge or Polyhaven. He keeps it simple. However, he makes it look really good because he adds things like graffiti, signs, decals, and trash, which if you want a one-click way to add trash to your scene, check out my add-on, link below. But he adds that to the texture to break it up. For example, he'll add in scaled down cubes as tiles to his texture. So it's not just a flat plane with an image slapped on it, that it's actually got some objects and like things on top of it to break up the way the light interacts with it. Honestly, variation is king in the texturing world. Whether that's adding color variation with a mix RGB with a noise texture and a color ramp, or adding roughness variation, whatever it is, mixing it up and making it look different is the key to making things that look real. My last tip is use reflections. I mean, every 3D scene looks like it's wet, and that's because reflections are a great way to add more detail simply. So that's texturing. Let's move on to modeling. Now, modeling is like texturing, where you have different techniques for different kinds of scenes. Like for environments, you'll do something completely different than if you're trying to model accurately your water bottle. Modeling can sometimes be the hardest part of your scene. I mean, you're trying to create something out of nothing. So my biggest tip for all kinds of modeling is to go into it with a goal in mind. I can't just open up Blender with nothing and try and create something out of that default cube. It just doesn't work. So I need to have some images, reference, or something else that I've come up with before I go into Blender. For environments, the most important part with your modeling is the block out stage. And if you don't have your modeling mastered, you might just end up sitting there and deleting the default cube and adding it back in over and over and over and over again. So the way to master the blockout phase is to get into a flow state where you're completely concentrated and focused on Blender. There are no other distractions and you're just there moving around cubes, beveling, insetting like never before. Another thing is, you don't want to have all these preconceptions and rules in your mind. Like, oh, I'm not allowed to intersect cubes, or it has to fit exactly on the floor. No. That will stop the flow and you'll just get out of that creative phase immediately. To get awesome detail when you're modeling an environment, you want to actually intersect cubes, bevel them, extrude them out. It just adds intricacy and makes the light bounce around in a nice kind of different way, just to break up like your monotone flat cubes. My biggest tip would be just to get into this free flow state where you don't really care how the cubes intersect. It doesn't really make sense, but you're just trying to make it look cool. I mean, isn't that what we're trying to do? To make a render that you're really proud of and you think looks really good? So it doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to be architecturally correct or anything. It just has to look cool. So beveling things, intersecting them, adding insets, all that kind of stuff just adds level of detail because the light's bouncing around differently. As we said with texturing, variation is king. The same applies for environment modeling. Now, when you're modeling real life objects, reference is so important. You can add that in images as planes and put that in the background of your scene and kind of just like model it and drag the vertices to where that picture is. That's a great way to do it. And even better is if you have the object in real life. So you can look at it and look at the extrusions, the insets, all that stuff, because you want to get it down to the exact detail of the real life object. Shortcuts are also king in the modeling world. You want to make sure you know exactly which shortcuts to do what, because otherwise you might end up breaking that creative flow and then you've lost all that passion and that momentum that you were having. Another hot tip I have is remember to bevel. I think not enough beginners are told this, but every object in real life doesn't have the sharp object like you see in Blender. So every edge in Blender you want to bevel. It just helps the light to bounce off the object in a realistic way. Modeling just takes practice, whether that's opening up a new Blender scene and trying to create a whole environment, or trying to model your water bottle, or following a YouTube tutorial on modeling. It just takes time and practice to learn those shortcuts and to know what looks good. So those are the 3 fundamental building blocks to help you create godly renders. Hopefully it helped you. Make sure to like and comment so other people can see this video and save time when they're learning Blender. And hopefully this does actually help you create godly renders, because I want to help you guys create the renders you want to make. Thanks for watching and keep going with Blender. You got this.